Well, it's 3 o'clock right on the dot. I like to, be cognizant of people's time. So we have us from California. My name is Dr. Jackie Jacob. I am the Poultry Extension Project Manager here at the University of Kentucky. As part of my job description, I coordinate the community of practice for small and backyard flocks through e-extension, which is the electronic version of the National Cooperative Extension Service here in the United States. Every state has offices, so I hope you are all familiar with your local county extension agents. We work with small and backyard flocks, and we have our website, which I will put in. We have a Facebook page, we have a YouTube channel. All of these videos are recorded and available for later viewing. And we do monthly webinars, as I say. And so this month's webinar is going to be on vermiculture for backyard flocks. So Sara Cloft and her husband are going to be giving us the presentation. It was Danielle, right? Daniel, right?
Dominic.
I knew it started with a D. Sorry about that. Okay, my fault. So they will be giving their presentation today. I will be on mute. You won't see my video or you won't hear me. I will be monitoring the chat box though. So if you have a question at any time, feel free to include it in the chat or in the Q&A box, which is supposed to be active. Yes, it is. As I said, I will be monitoring both of those. If the question is a clarification of something being said at the moment, I will pop up and ask for the clarification. Otherwise, we'll hold questions to the end. But if you're like me, if you don't type your question right away, you forget it. So feel free to do that at any time, and we'll answer the questions at the end. So it's all yours. You guys can go for it. I'll wait till you get everything set up before I go on mute.
Excellent. Welcome, y'all. Like Jackie said, I am Sara Cloft, and this is my husband, Dominic Kupelski. I am a poultry extension professional out of Purdue University, and I have lovingly drafted my husband, who is a soil and ecosystem scientist, to help today, just to ensure that the information we're providing to you gives you more than just the how do you do worms, but a little bit more of the why and some of the science behind it as well. So he's actually going to kick it off with some of the science.
Yeah, so as Sara said, my name is Dominic. I'm with Michigan Technological University, and I studied forest science, forest soils, and biogeochemistry, which is a lot of what we'll be talking about today, whether that term is familiar to you or not. So to give you a brief overview of what we're going to be telling you about today, we're breaking this into two major sections, basically my section, starting with what is vermicomposting and how it works, its pros and cons, and that sort of thing. And then Sara will take over and talk to us about how it can be applied for the backyard poultry flock. So, as promised, what is vermicomposting? Put it simply, vermicomposting is simply composting with the help of worms. These worms might be volunteers or brought in, either purchased from some worm farm, or just invited or coerced into helping you by digging a hole and gathering up some worms of your own. A few common species of worms which are used or very commonly used in vermicomposting whenever people are being selective about their worms, which you could do or not do. It's a very flexible system. Red wigglers, European night crawlers, African night crawlers, or just whatever native worms happen to be around, which you can invite into your compost piles. But the important thing about worms is these different species behave differently. They all do similar things. They all have similar body plans, but they have different habitats and slightly different diets, which we can get into. On a very basic level, this is how vermicomposting works. Essentially, you have a regular compost pile with some specific properties which make them a little bit more conducive to worm habitation. You feed it with organic matter, maybe some extra carbon in the form of shredded paper or wood shavings, etc. And this organic matter, it can be the chicken litter, it could be, food scraps, it can be old newspaper ads that you don't want, if anyone even gets a newspaper anymore. And the worms will work along with the other organisms that live in the compost to break that down and make fertile um, compost material, which is made of decomposed organic matter and worm castings, which is to say worm poop. It's very fertile material for growing plants, and it can be used in a variety of ways in the garden, um, or conceivably also sold to other people who are looking to do some gardening or farming. So what is it that worms are really bringing to the table if you can start it with regular compost? Basically, worms are decomposers, so they assist in breaking down organic matter. Under normal composting conditions, you would, I hope you can see my cursor here, take some organic matter with a certain carbon to nitrogen ratio, which you probably won't be able to just detect by looking at it. This is more of a scientific thing, but it helps explain how the process works. In traditional composting, oxygen flows into the compost through diffusion, and microorganisms within it decompose it the way we eat hamburgers and so on and so forth. They're eating compost, and the metabolism generates heat and carbon dioxide. So you get a smaller volume of organic matter, but it's been broken down and made more, the nutrients within it are more plant available. Adding worms to this process um, basically helps it along by speeding things up in certain ways. But habit, the habitat requirements of worms can also slow things down in other ways, which I'll get into further along. But the way that worms help is basically they participate in this whole food web, which is going on inside that compost pile. The microbes are eating the compost, the worms eat the microbes, um, and then different things eat the worms. And um, so they all participate in a food web, and this speeds up the decomposition of the organic material because the more mouths that are eating on it and eating each other, the quicker things go. Because instead of having to wait for some organism's entire lifespan, they get eaten by something else, and then that something poops out that material. And so nutrients just get cycled more quickly in a food web situation. Um, Worms also burrow, which helps mix things together and provide air passages to get that oxygen down into the compost. Um, and that can also speed things up because if you don't have enough air circulation, then your compost won't go as fast as it might otherwise be able to. Um, And one of the important plant available nutrients within compost is nitrogen. That's the N in the C to N ratio. So nitrogen is found in proteins and generally green plant material. Anyone that's familiar with composting is familiar with balancing your browns, which is carbon dominant materials, and your greens, which are more nitrogen rich materials. Um, Sarah will tell you more about where chicken litter falls into that spectrum. But you generally want to balance these because if we look back at this, most compost ends up with a C to N ratio of about 10. And so anything that is above 10 or lower than 10 is going to be wasted. So if you have a higher than 10 C to N ratio, you're going to get carbon dioxide, which is lost without really being attained as carbon within the compost. And if you have a lower ratio than that, if you have an excess of nitrogen, then nitrogen will be lost from the compost, which is something you'd like to avoid because it can cause the compost to stink in the form of ammonia, and it represents a loss of nutrients that you could otherwise be providing to your garden. And so you can see right here in the middle, decomposers are a key part of the nitrogen cycle. So that's where worms are fitting in this area. And this food web is just a visual demonstration of what I was talking about earlier, the organic matter from plants or other organic waste. They're processed through bacteria, fungi, nematodes, and things, and then they're eaten by different little critters inside. And worms play a part in that as well by grazing upon the fungi and the bacteria, which are already breaking things down and helping speed up the process through their digestion. So there are pros and cons to using different approaches to composting, whether that's traditional composting, which I'll talk about now, or vermicomposting, which I'll talk about next. The aim of traditional composting is essentially to maximize the decomposition of organic material through microbial pathways. And the best way to accomplish this is the use of mesophilic and thermophilic microbes. Mesophilic means medium temperature, and thermophilic means higher temperature, up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit in some cases. So this is much hotter than you or I would like it, and it's a lot hotter than worms would like it, which is why this ideal concept of microbial composting or traditional composting doesn't necessarily work with vermicomposting because the worms would be fleeing from a compost at that temperature. But the advantage of this hot, fast composting is A, that it's fast, and B, that it's hot, which means it can kill harmful bacteria like you're cooking a piece of chicken in the oven, and even weed seeds, which makes you have to do less work when you're applying compost in the garden. The maximum efficiency approach to this requires a lot of frequent turning to make sure that green materials and brown materials are in contact with one another and everything stays in balance, because the composting will be slowed down and cooled off by having an imbalance in that ratio of carbon to nitrogen. So the pros are it's fast, it can be fast, and it can process a large amount of material quickly because of that speed. But the downside is it if you don't have ideal circumstances, then it's going to be slowed down, and you need sort of a critical mass of compost to be able to build up that temperature and reach that maximum rate of composting. So it becomes less advantageous if you have smaller amounts, like just personal kitchen food scraps, for example. The pros and cons of vermicomposting are that it works better at these smaller scales because it doesn't need to attain heat. You don't need as much, so the small scale is not a problem. It can be lower effort because you don't have to manually turn this compost. The worms and things inside, they're going to move things around inside it there to keep it all well mixed. And so it can be lower effort in that way. A lot of people also claim that it provides more balanced compost material, which is a really it's not a very strong word. Basically, what it means is by allowing this decomposition to happen through the food web, if there was an excess of pathogenic bacteria, for example, these pathogenic bacteria, they need specific environmental conditions, and having worms and thriving food web basically moderates that to a lower level, but it won't necessarily be able to just kill it outright. It's just changing the environment. So if you had something that loved to infect people and lived and thrived in their guts, a gut environment is a lot different than a vermicomposting environment. So they would tend to naturally decrease over time, which is helpful, but it's not a foolproof solution. And then, as Sarah will get to later, worms and other decomposers like insects can provide enrichment and nutrition to chickens if you provide them access. Or the worms could be separated from the compost and fed directly to the chickens. versus just allowing the chickens to have at the compost, which can be advantageous as well. The cons are, like I said, it can't actively kill the harmful bacteria or the weed seeds. And you also, since it doesn't generate as much heat, it does generate some, but the food webs are going to change seasonally and over time. So if you live someplace with a harsh winter or very hot, dry summers, then these can negatively impact the worms, which need a comfortable temperature between like 50 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit in order to do their best work. Otherwise, they're going to go into hibernation or die off. Um, and so basically, you're taking care of living creatures in this compost, and they need certain conditions, which I'm coming to right now. Um, in order to manage these conditions, you have to manage 5 different categories of situations. The right temperature, as I was saying, seasonality plays into this. Shading plays into this. If you live in a very hot place, you wouldn't want to put it right out in the open. Providing a little shade could really help temperature moderation. So like I said, 50 to 90 degrees is ideal. They can survive shorter periods because of the insulation of the compost above and below that temperature. And they will self-regulate by moving away from hotter temperatures and colder temperatures towards places that are more comfortable to them because they do have agency. Um, so they're able to take care of themselves to an extent. But then this is where the different species of worms come into play again. For example, the depth plays a big role. You have these 3 different types of worms, which are broad categorizations. The epigeic worms, which live in the very top of the soil, and they like to eat leaf litter that falls directly upon it. Endogeic worms, which live in the top approximately 1 foot of soil. And then the anisic worms, which are generally larger and make deep burrows, which they return to over and over. So anisic worms are kind of like ants in that they build their own situation. Whereas these other 2 worms, they'll just kind of aimlessly move around to places with better conditions that have better food, better temperature, things like that, better moisture, which is the next thing. So basically, when vermicomposting, if you have red wigglers, they're going to prefer to be in shallower compost, so it's better for smaller scales. Whereas earthworms or whatever native worms may prefer deeper piles um, and provide different I don't know how to describe this. Different services, quote unquote, to the compost. Like an anisic one making those burrows would do a lot of mixing and creating air passages, whereas the other ones would do less of that, but they would do perhaps more eating. Um, at least for a given weight of worms. How you determine that is sort of a matter of perspective. Anyway, great moisture, a worm, it doesn't have very thick skin, so it's going to need to be moist, but not so wet that it's dripping. Basically, you want the compost to be able to feel moist to your hand, but when squeezed, not release water. Of course, you can allow it to get more wet, but free drainage is important so that the worms don't drown. I'm sure that you've seen worms crawling out of the soil when it rains. That's what happens when they have too much water because they're essentially drowning. They rely on oxygen diffusion across their skin to breathe. And when they're immersed in water, the oxygen is not diffusing into them. Um, on the other hand, if they're too dry, they'll just turn into flaky abyss and they won't be doing any compost processing for you.
They'll be compost.
Yes, they will become compost themselves. And then the right disturbance situation. So under traditional composting, you might turn it every few days. But worms, especially anisic ones, which are not the typical composting worms, but they can involve themselves. If you have an open compost bottom, they can just invite themselves in. Basically, worms don't prefer to be disturbed as much as microbes, which don't really care, because worms build burrows, and they are just bothered by people. So worms, in a lot of cases, vermicompost thrives on neglect, people say. So a lot of people treat the worms as their pets and are constantly checking on them. And then when they forget about them for 2 or 3 weeks, they come back and they find they're doing better than ever because they haven't been bothered by people. And then finally, the right bedding, which we'll talk about more. But basically, the worms need a place to live that can be compost. But when you're starting off, you don't necessarily need you don't necessarily have compost yet. So we need to create a habitat for them. So fundamentally, in order to get started vermicomposting, you only need three things: a place to do it, a cover so that you can manage light and moisture, preferably a cover that you can take on and off. Um, if you're doing indoor vermicomposting, a lot of times you're going to want to take that cover off because worms like to explore looking for more food. And if the cover is on and it's blocking out the light, they're going to start exploring into your house.
Yeah, we had that happen and they'll dry out in your carpet. It is not fun to clean up.
Yeah. Um, so having the cover off can be helpful to keep them where they really ought to be, or having the cover on can help them feel settled in place, especially when they're first getting established. And then, of course, managing moisture if you're doing it outside, being able to make sure it doesn't rain on it too much, or if you live in a very dry place, that too much evaporation isn't drying the thing out before you can get to it and water if you need to. And then you need the material for the bedding, like I was talking about before. And again, that can be existing compost, or when starting up, as you can see in the top picture here, moistened shredded paper makes a great compost starter material because it's rich in carbon, so it doesn't break down as quickly, and it gives them some shelter and a place to live while the food scraps start breaking down. And then once they've started breaking down, then the worms start to like it. They like it aged. They like the leftovers better than the fresh meals because they're decomposers. If it's too fresh, it's not good for them. So starting out depends on what scale you're going for. You can purchase starter kits, you can purchase these bin systems, you can build your own plastic tote by drilling some holes into a plastic tote for ventilation and drainage. The worms will explore and they will escape out of those holes. But if you use light to keep them inside the bin, then they will generally obey that suggestion. Or you can build your own area if you're looking at a larger scale, as you saw in the previous slide. You can have a whole hoop house dedicated to it, or just a corner of your yard or whatever. And then you need to purchase the worms from someplace like Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, which we've used successfully multiple times to start our own vermicomposting in different states.
There's lots of others. We're not saying you have to use Uncle Jim's.
Yeah, we're not sponsored or anything. And you can recruit from or draft forcefully your local population of worms, which can be invited in gently by just starting compost on the ground and allowing them to come to the food. Or, you can go around trying to dig up worms and collect them. Generally, you would want to have like at least 50 worms if you were collecting or purchasing them so that you can start a population going. I think worms are often sold at a pound. So
I
like
think
a
that's the
pound,
5-pound bag in the picture.
yeah. And then you just throw them in your composting area with the right bedding material, and they get right to work after a couple of days, provided the food and bedding is okay. So starting up is the most um, dangerous part because they've been traveled, they've been captured potentially, they're adapting to a new situation. So, and again, the food has to be old, it has to be starting to decompose. So, um, give them a little time and be patient with them. Uh, they just started. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to explain to you how chickens can be part of this whole system. and where the two can work together.
Yeah. So I want to preface by saying we're here at a poultry conversation, but this really can apply to any sort of animal manure. So rabbits, this is used with a lot as well. This can be used for horse manure, cattle manure, goats, sheep, really anything. I would say that please don't put human wastes in vermicompost, especially if you plan on putting it on any sort of garden where you are going to then potentially harvest. It's also against the law in most places as well. But technically, from a pure biology standpoint, it could be done. So when you think about poultry litter, you're really going to have two systems kind of coming into play in most small flock settings. So you kind of have what you see in the lower corner where you have more of a what we're calling a deep bedding situation where you have shavings or straw or some sort of combination that you kind of add on to, and you'll keep that in place for a set period of time, somewhere from a month to half a year or sometimes a whole year. People often will do this during the winter time if you're in a cold environment. Or alternatively, you have a thin layer of shavings over a floor that you will completely remove out or do spot cleanings periodically as well. So those two environments create different types of litter. So that's kind of what you can see where the two pictures have the arrows pointing. So from a deep bedding situation, you're going to have you have almost a mini compost environment starting because the shavings and the straw will have microbes on them. There will be microbes from within the chicken's body that gets excreted through the manure, and those will interact with each other. And then if you're using a coop or some sort of enclosure where they have access to the soil, like you put it on top of the ground and that's where your litter accumulates, or you just have a dirt floor, then some of the microbes in the soil or some of your volunteer worms will start to move into that environment as well. And so you'll have some of this decomposition that Dominic's been talking about starting in your house as well. And that is totally fine. On the contrast, if you have that kind of thin layer of litter, you're not really going to have any of that, and it's going to be very, very dry. So those two different types of litter that you remove will create different feed stuff that you can put into your vermicompost, and we'll go into a little bit more of the challenges and the way that you manage that here in the next couple of slides. But I always want to talk about a little bit about how do you manage litter and what do you need to kind of keep in mind with any system. In general, you want dry litter because the skin on the bottom of the feet for chickens is actually fairly thin and soft, and they can get sores pretty easily. Additionally, chickens really like to scratch. That is one of their major behaviors. You can see that in this picture below. They're all kind of pecking in the bottom, and that's really how they express a lot of their behavior is by interacting with their environment, the scratching, the pecking. So it's really important from just a welfare of these birds that you give them places to interact as well. Additionally, you want to make sure that the litter is dry to prevent that ammonia. So like Dominic said earlier with compost, when it starts to smell, it means that you're having a volatilization reaction going on, and the nitrogen specifically usually is the culprit that is in your litter from your manure as reacting and is creating this kind of ammonia smell. That can cause, if it's in a very concentrated environment, that can cause issues to the vision and to the nasal health of the bird. So they can start to get ulcerations. And when you walk in there as well, it's not going to be very pleasant. This is not something that you're likely to have too much of an issue throughout most of the year, but if you have to keep your coop closed up because of a really cold weather or due to some sort of other extreme environmental condition, that's something that you want to keep in mind. Additionally, you're going to want to add fresh material. Like I said, if you're in a deep litter environment, you already have that decomposition kind of starting. So some of your shavings are going to be broken down. The additional interaction of these chickens kind of scratching and moving through there, that's going to also physically break down this material. And as this material gets broken down, it's going to have less water holding capacity. So when your chickens then defecate into this litter, you lose your effectiveness if your litter is already being broken down. Additionally, if you're just doing a thin layer, you just need to keep removing that regularly because it doesn't have the ability to absorb all that moisture over time. Similarly, if you have a water spill, like they flip over your water or you get a leak or something like that, you're going to want to just take out that entire wet spot entirely. because that is going to be a big culprit for disease vector. So that's going to recruit a lot of pathogenic bacteria. It's usually going to help them thrive. And let's be honest, chickens always like to do the least appropriate thing that we would want them to do. That is going to be the one spot that they're all going to want to be playing, and they're all going to come into contact with it, and it could become a problem. I also highly recommend that everybody takes the time to completely strip out their litter of all types. So if you're using the deep litter bedding or your entire coop, and do a full cleaning down. So if you can wash things with soap and water, that's phenomenal. That's going to really help with just overall health of your birds. And it will give you the opportunity to generate manure for vermicomposting. So another obligatory pathogens, as we said, can transmit through the litter. So there's a lot of microbes. Salmonella and Campylobacter are really great examples. These can become foodborne pathogens, and they don't harm your chickens. So they're commensal bacteria in chickens, but they will be normally as part of their microbiome, and it can come out into the feces. And this feces environment, if you're going to then be using that into compost, can potentially be transmitted and come onto your crops or things like that. This is where it's important when you're thinking about vermiculture. You want to look at that temperature. Dominic talked a lot about how hot compost is better. So if you think your chickens are sick, so you start seeing some of these abnormal chicken poop variations, like I have kind of in this graphic here, maybe you don't want to put that into something that's going straight into your worms. Maybe that's one where you have a dedicated hot compost pile that you turn, because you don't want to risk some of that transmitting to you. Now, most things that get chickens sick will not get you sick, but there are things that can be transmitted and can cause problems. And when in doubt, if you ever see a lot of mass mortality or a lot of abnormal things, please reach out to a vet. That's always going to be very important.
I just want to point out the wormy chicken poop and things on the right side.
Oh.
Different kinds of worms. Okay.
Yes, very, very different worms. They will not hurt the worms in your vermicompost, but you also don't want them to continue to spread, because if you allow your chickens to come into contact with your pile, they can get reinfected, or they could potentially infect wild birds that are moving around your environment, and then that can cycle back through and get your chickens reinfected as well. There's opportunities for food web interactions. So talking now about vermicompost, Dominic did a great job about giving us all of the kind of mechanics that you need to consider when you're thinking about your compost pile with worms. Let's talk about adding, and this is generally all manure, but we're talking about chicken manure here today. So manure is going to be really high in nitrogen. This typically is thought of in the form of ammonia, which I talked about. If you get wet, it can be smelly. Additionally, a lot of the feedstuffs, especially if you are like me and you love giving little snacks to your chickens, like I love walking out with a loaf of bread that is gone stale and just playing with the chickens with that. All of that can also cause salt to be accumulated in the manure, and applying that directly to the worms will be very toxic. And this goes back to what Dominic said about how oxygen needs to diffuse into the worms in order for them to breathe. Ammonia can also cross that skin barrier, just like water and oxygen, which can cause death. On the flip side, especially in those thin layer settings of your shavings, your poultry manure is probably going to be very, very dry. So adding it into your compost will potentially cause overall reduction in the amount of available moisture that worms will have to move through the environment, because this dry poultry litter will suck up water that is in your compost pile, and you might throw off some of your balance. Additionally, if you are trying to maintain a population size of a specific set amount, your chickens eating worms can potentially be a problem. Now, you can plan around this if you want them to, and usually if you have composting out in a pile environment and you have worms around, you'll have plenty of worms that letting your chickens have access to it is not a problem. Additionally, I highly recommend that you do a little bit of pre-processing for your manure before you throw it into your compost pile, especially if you're doing small scale, not large pile composting. Opportunities, I think Dominic really did a great job, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on this, but the worms can kind of really help with your compost pile. And there's a lot of people that do these hybrid kind of piles where they'll pre-process, which I will get into in the next slide, I promise. They'll pre-process their manure, and then as their manure ages, they'll give it access to the worms, and the worms can kind of migrate into this kind of manure-rich environment that maybe has food scraps, has straw, extra things added as well to make it more enticing. And that's a way that you can use the worms to kind of help your overall compost productivity, and it can give you a chance to then allow the part where the worms moved out of to be ready for harvest. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So getting a little technical here, nitrogen comes from the proteins, specifically the amino acids, which are the building blocks of the proteins that are being fed in all of the diets. And specifically, if you look at this picture of poop, a lot of the nitrogen is going to be concentrated in this uric acid cap, or the white cap that you'll see on your feces, or anybody that's walked outside their car and seen bird poop on it. That's their equivalent of urine. So mammals make urea, and that is what we excrete as part of our urine. Chickens like to be complicated, and so they go through a much more complex pathway and they create uric acid. Uric acid has a lot of nitrogen locked in there compared to urea. And that's one of the reasons why, especially chicken poop, you should pre-process before you put it in to a compost pile. So some of the ways that you can pre-process is going to be by aging it, so just storing it in place, or there are a few people that I like to recommend. So redworm composting is a individual. He is in Ontario, Canada, and he does a lot of helpful information about how to compost. It's a hobby of his, and so he posts a lot. And this is his recommendation for working with poultry manure, though I will caveat by saying somehow he has pigeon manure, and that is what is currently being pictured in these kind of clippings that I took. And so what he is doing is, after it has been stored for a period of time, he's putting the manure into a kind of a feed bag, and he is pouring water through it to help kind of accumulate moisture in there again. He said that he's leaving it for about a week of it kind of soaking in this kind of feed bag, and then he is adding it to an existing compost. The specific compost pile that he has in this bin here, he says, is primarily horse manure and straw that he has been aging together. The two important components there is, one, that he let it age on its own, and then he added water. And by doing that, he's allowing it to interact. He's neutralizing the ammonia, he's increasing the overall moisture, and he's then adding it to existing compost where there are existing microbes, and in this case, there's existing worms that are coming in and they're helping to break it down. He's then covering it because he was keeping this bin in an indoor environment that didn't have a very high humidity profile. So he's covering it to help keep it kind of moist. Another way to do it, if you are using a pile, is to have a separate pile, or to have a cap, like I just kind of talked about earlier, where you put all of your poultry manure in a pile, and you allow it just to kind of sit there in the environment, and you maybe turn it every couple of weeks, and then you start to add that in as you're feeding the rest of your pile of worms. So along with, next time you go to take your food scraps, you'll go and you'll grab a bucket of your poultry manure out of the pile. This is really great after you're cleaning out your deep litter environment. So a lot of people will do this if they deep litter over the winter and they do a big spring clean out. They'll make a big pile of all of the litter that they pulled out of their coop, and then they'll just kind of work through it over the next month or so of putting it into their vermicompost pile and getting rid of it on its own. The downside there is that if you don't have a really good designated spot, you may be having volunteer worms coming over from your pile and doing that. You also potentially will need an additional space if you don't want them to mix in. The reason that the pre-compost or the pre-processing is important is because you really want to give it time for that heat to accumulate, just because there are microbes that could become pathogenic to humans that don't cause any problems to chickens, and so you won't know that you have it. You should always just assume that your chickens probably have salmonella or something inside their body that could get you sick, and so you should probably be careful with how you're going to add it to something that potentially can become on your food source. So summarizing all the different ways that I talked about, the two big things you want to keep in mind is you want to neutralize the ammonia. That can be by just piling and giving it time to age, or you can also add it to existing piles of manure, or you can also get some of these microbial culture products. EM1 is a pretty popular one. I think it's a lactobacillus liquid. You can order them online from Amazon. And you can add that to your pile of poultry manure that you've removed from your coop. I don't necessarily know if it's worth buying additional microbial assistance, but that is an option if you want to kind of move faster.
Especially if you're just getting started and you don't have an existing compost pile with an existing community of microbes. Having microbial assistance there could help a lot in just getting it started, in recruiting microbes to break things down.
Yeah, if you don't have a neighbor or somebody nearby that has a compost pile or another source of manure that you can get access to. So I know a lot of people, they like to combine cattle manure and poultry litter. I don't really know why. I think maybe it's an Indiana thing. We have a lot of cattle here. But they'll have aged cow manure, and that is already starting to break down. The way that cow manure is, let's just say, larger and wetter than a typical poultry manure. And that gives it more surface area for microbes to move through. There are different microbes coming out of a cow than there are chickens. It's just a little faster at getting started with compost, generally speaking. The other part that you want to do is you want to adjust that moisture. So while you're putting it in your pile, this is a good time to maybe add some water. Maybe you leave the pile somewhat uncovered to allow rain or normal, hydrophilic reactions to occur. And then additionally, this is a good time if you have some food waste, you can start to add some food waste and do like a mini compost just to get it kind of started as you're getting started. And then you add it to your worms. So another possibility that you can do, and this is if you want to get a little bit more creative, is if you have something like show chickens, and yes, I know that these are rabbits in the picture on the left, but it's the best kind of example I was able to find. So I know some people that are raising really nice show chickens, they'll start them in cages, or if they're having bantams, you can have them up on wire just to kind of keep them away from things, try to keep their plumage up. If you have situations where you have birds up in cages or even just off the ground, like you have like a porch or patio, something for your coop, you can put an accumulation pile underneath. In this instance, it's got the chickens kind of blocked away from it by having these grids, the wire grid on the left, and you've got these kind of enrichment roosts on the right. The picture on the right is actually a video from an Agra influencer. He posted this on YouTube a few years ago, and he's in Thailand. And what he's done is he's got these kind of cement rings, and he essentially has his worm compost bins literally inside his coop. So all he does is when he goes to clean out his coop is he just adds it on top there, and he will rotate which pile. So what you can't really see well in this picture is that the worms have the ability to move between those different cement blocks. There's holes between them, so he can feed in one and he can process in another one, and the worms will migrate because, as Dominic said, they will move to a place that they're most enticed to be. And if you don't add food to a compost, in this instance, he's got these 4 rings. If you don't add it to one of those, the worms will move away from it because they're going to seek food. This is a concept that you can also do as well. You can feed in different regions of your bin, or on your pile. You can feed the left half versus the right half and start to drive all your worms into the left half, and then you can start to harvest the castings out of your right. And if you're doing it inside the coop house, keep your chickens away or they will eat all of your worms. They don't care that you're trying to do good things for the environment or help your garden. They just want to play and eat the worms. Okay, we talked about the science of compost. We talked about the chickens. Now I want to talk a little bit about the worms, because as an animal scientist, chickens are worms, so I feel like they should get some respect as well. So talking a little bit about the life cycle, worms are really good at kind of taking care of themselves. As Dominic said, they thrive on neglect. So you don't need to worry about maintaining a population inside too much unless you run into massive die-offs from predator massive water leakages into it to cause like a flooding event, or too dry conditions from either it being too cold or too hot and everybody moving away or into designated areas. Additionally, even if you have a large die-off, if you can keep those cocoons, which look like, I don't know, little jelly balls.
Yeah, if you have kids, Orbeez.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I don't know, they're about less than a centimeter across, just pinkish to yellowish.
Yeah.
Spheres, sometimes with pointed ends.
Yeah. So those cocoons are their eggs, and you can repopulate an entire bin just from the cocoons from a previous one if something traumatic were to happen and all of your adults were gone. That also means if you're trying to do that kind of windrow method or your pile method and you're trying to encourage your worms to move away, you may need to give it a little longer than you think if you don't want to accidentally spread all your next generation of worms into your garden, which is also fine.
Yeah, you can just give it time for the cocoons to hatch and the limbs to grow up and migrate, or you can just allow them to be in your garden where they'll just keep on doing the same things they have been doing, aerating and mixing the soil. In certain regions like Michigan, for example, which has received glaciers in the recent few thousand years, several thousand years. Um, you the worms that you might have purchased to do vermicomposting won't necessarily be native, so you might need to worry about that some more. Um, but in other places like California, where it's never seen a glacier in the past several million years, um, you won't need to worry about that as much.
That also does mean you want to be careful if you want to use your vermicompost for indoor things. So we have a lot of potted plants, and we would top off our potted plants with vermicompost every spring as part of our repotting and kind of taking care of our plant routine. And there would be about a couple weeks where we'd have new worms in our house that we did not anticipate because we missed a few cocoons. It's not that big of a deal. They don't really thrive in that kind of potted plant environment, and so they'll typically die off. But it is something that if you then have a pet inside, you or children that want to dig around and find worms, it can be something that you want to keep in mind as well. So been talking a little bit about you can do this for harvesting, but let's talk a little bit more about harvesting intentionally. So there's a couple products that Dominic's talked about. So the castings, which is the worm poop essentially, is that golden compost. That's what you really want to be giving to them. So if you look at the bottom picture on the right where this woman is using a screen over a bin, she is screening out kind of the castings so that she can use the compost to move on. So she on top, anything that is too big to go through this filter is not done being composted, and she's going to put it most likely going to put it back in her compost pile with her worms to continue breaking down. This also means if you look, there's no screen that is going to be small enough to allow you to not accidentally send eggs through, as I talked about with those cocoons. So that's something to keep in mind. The picture directly above is a less intense or less manual way of doing that. So what they've done is they've basically taken their bin or taken sections of their pile and created small piles on a tarp. What happens there is because worms like to explore and they're looking for safe and they're looking for food stuff, the worms are all going to kind of move into the middle of those piles. And so you can start to kind of scrape along the side to find castings and remove the worms safely, more or less. It's not as easy as it sounds. We tried it once.
We've done it multiple times.
Yeah.
They flee the light, and so they keep going deeper and deeper. So you can kind of scrape off the sides, and it's a very manual process.
Really good to do with kids.
Yeah.
If they want to get involved.
But my recommendation would be to simply fork compost or shovel compost into a wheelbarrow and spread it directly on the garden as a mulch. Because if you don't worry about saving every single worm or cocoon, which you're not going to be able to do anyway, you can save 90% of the time by just using it directly. And if there's some coarse material in there, oh no, you have more organic material in your garden.
Yeah. So then the last kind of product that we haven't really talked about is going to be worm tea. So worm tea is the kind of liquid.
It's often called compost tea.
Yeah.
You'll hear a lot about the miracles of compost tea from composters and gardeners on the internet. My perspective on it is the worm tea is not really a desirable product. It's pretty nasty smelling. You can use it as a liquid fertilizer. A lot of people like to aerate it using an air stone and an air pump to try to improve it, or they do all sorts of things, add fish emulsion and bone meal and algae and whatever to enrich it, make their super compost. But really, this is just excess water. Like I said before, the ideal compost moisture for both microbes and worms is moist, but not enough to squeeze or drip through. Um, Ideally, you would just maintain your moisture levels to a degree where all the nutrition that is in the compost stays within the compost and doesn't get washed through. If you can't control the amount of water that's coming in because you don't have a cover or whatnot, having a way for it to drain away can be helpful. And I suppose if you want to have every nutrient you put in there retained as much as possible, you could try to collect that
And
stuff.
most
But
starter kits, like especially those towers, will have a tap for the tea so that you can help drain. It's rather difficult when you're first getting started, especially in a bin, to know instinctively how much moisture is too much moisture. So the tap can be helpful to help you kind of get a better feel for that. So it's kind of personal preference. If you're working with chickens, you already have to have some outdoor space. So this may not be something that you really need to spend too much time because it's probably going to be like a million times easier to just have a pile outside where you have your worms. So the last one point that I really want to talk about is going to be winter. So for Michigan Tech, especially up in the Upper Peninsula and in Indiana, we had a decent amount of snow this year and we had a lot of really cold days. So if you're going to be doing outside worms, which like I said, just said is much easier than doing bins inside, you're going to want to worry about temperature. Dominic's talked a lot about the ideal temperature that worms have. So what do you do when it is getting to be 0 or below 0, and not to mention wind chill, because wind chill can do some damage to these worms in these piles. So what you want to do is you want to think about insulation, whether that be you add insulation around a bin or a pile, you cover the pile, or you create insulation by adding more material. So if you add feed, you're going to be giving a kind of a jump start to your bin. They're going to have a little bit of a lag, and then that temperature is going to increase. That's what's being shown on this graph kind of at the bottom. They added feed on that kind of Tuesday, Wednesday mark, and then by Thursday, Friday, Saturday, the pile was much warmer. So the caution though, if you're going to be adding too much feed, especially outside, when you create that warm and food environment, is you're going to also be attracting pests. So you may want to pay a little bit more attention to the pets. And of course, if you have bins or things that are movable, you can very easily just move them into your basement, into your garage, or your greenhouse. Really, what you need to be managing is the wind. You want to kind of keep them so that they're not getting a lot of wind and drafts kind of coming in and drying them out and keeping them really cold. But is there anything else I missed on that point?
just so the other thing is, when things cool down, the decomposition and the metabolism of all the decomposers slow down, which means that less heat is generated from their activities, but it also means that less oxygen is consumed by them. A lot of them will go into a sort of hibernation during the
Especially
cold months.
natives.
Yeah, especially native microbes and decomposers and worms. Um, so that means that you can make larger piles which provide more insulation because the oxygen demand will be lower while it's colder. So you can counterbalance the lack of heat from metabolism and the lower outside temperatures by having a larger pile, which can hold its temperature better off. And the worms and the other decomposers, they will self-manage. So if it's too little oxygen, they won't go as deep. If it's too cold, then they will go deeper, and they'll find their own happy medium, basically.
Yeah. So that's really all we have. We personally love vermicomposting, highly recommend it, and it is something that I think pairs really nicely with the poultry environment as well.
I agree with you. Very good presentation. We do have a couple of questions. Unfortunately, the person left, but they may come back and review the recording, so we'll make sure we answer that question. It's a two-part question. Will the Echinia, if released through castings, be considered invasive, causing the environmental problems that invasive worms are causing in the forests of the upper Midwest?
I am totally letting Dominic handle that one.
Yeah, so yes. As we got to later on, probably after that question was answered, yes, worms can, be invasive, especially in those forests where we had glaciers remove all the topsoil, kill off all the worms, and then develop for thousands of years after glaciers without worms. These forests are adapted to having higher amounts of leaf litter, which shelters certain plants and animals, and the addition of worms to those environments, which was going to happen naturally, very slowly as worms migrated back in, it can be accelerated by people introducing them. So, yeah, what I would recommend is, wherever possible, just recruit your own native worms. Um, a lot of populated areas already have worms, either from people introducing them or from them just being there the whole time. But if you must purchase worms in, I would advise looking up whichever worm you're considering purchasing and seeing whether it is native to your area before doing so.
The other thing, if you are going out and digging up worms, there are currently some invasive worms. I don't have the specific information about them for you, but there are worms like jumping worms and the kind of hammerhead worms that are becoming problematic, specifically because they destroy all of that litter environment. So if you do find those in your environment, and I'm sure your local extension agent can get you all of that information, those are not going to be ones that you want to recruit into your compost pile. You're probably going to want to kill those ones.
Yeah, although you might not be able to stop them from coming in.
Yes.
I mean, you can kill them when you find them, but worms are very numerous.
Yes.
And reproduce quickly. So, good luck. You might just have to come to an accord with them and have peace. Because war is not an option.
The hammerheads, are those the ones that if you cut them,
Yes.
And speaking of cutting worms, it is an old wives' tale that you can cut a worm in half to make it reproduce. That is not true. You just have a very injured worm which may or may not survive. And if it does survive, it will only regrow into one worm, not two. So just let them make babies
except for the
on their own.
hammerhead, right? Except for the hammerhead?
No, that's for all worms. Hammerheads specifically, they are extremely hardy. I know people have had some success by pouring salt on them that overwhelms the ability of oxygen to permeate through. And I don't advise this at all, but I have seen online that people will burn them. But I am never an advocate of burning them in an environment. That's where if you start to find them, please reach out to your local extension agent or your land grant university. They can help you find the right people to get you in contact with because they are hard to deal with.
And if nothing else, even if you can't combat them, it will help people who are tracking their spread know where they are if you report them.
We're getting alerts about hammerheads.
Yeah.
Okay, and then are the worms that we find in our local areas in manure piles, etc., Echinia fetida, F-E-T-I-D-A?
Yeah, so that's Echinia fetida is the red wiggler. I couldn't tell you just by a vague description of where they live, whether that's what species they are. There are many species of worms, and that even I don't I mean, I'm pretty into vermicomposting, but I don't identify worm species. Um, red
She's from
wigglers.
Puget Sound in Washington State.
Okay,
So
I'm not a West Coast man, so I couldn't tell you anything about the worms over there.
there are
But
really great resources online. So that red worm composter, he does a lot of blogs regularly. They have tons of really good pictures of how to identify the different species and some of the native worms as well. I will say on that, if you have like specifically if you're talking about like in a cow pie manure, so like a pile, and you see worms, it's likely not going to be the right type of worms. It's likely going to be more of the parasitic worms that are coming from the environment, because some of those like tapeworms and things can be quite long and look like some of these worms, though they're typically paler in color.
yeah, most vermicomposting worms you actually want are red, pink to purple color. They're not going to be white or transparent. There are white and transparent worms which are not harmful, but some of them are parasites.
Yeah, there are some species of white worms that if you see them in your compost pile, that's a problem because they're going to potentially be predators or potentially be problematic for the worms that you do want.
But again, that's all part of a food web. So as long as your worms are not totally dying off or getting really messed up, it's just the circle of life and it's helping the
Yeah.
decomposition take place.
Okay.
So I wouldn't worry too much.
Wouldn't we? Okay. Thank you very much. We're a little bit over time. The you have had people say thank you. They've enjoyed it. Very comprehensive. It's been recorded. It will be up shortly. You have their emails there if you would like to contact them for more information. If you want to join us next, where am I? Next month. Let me see what we have. I think it's from plants to poultry or something. Where is it? From plants to poultry, new ways to keep chickens healthy on September 3rd at 3 p.m. if you would like to join us for that. Pre-registration is, of course, required, and you can look on our Facebook page, our website page for the link to that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah and Dominique, not Daniel. I remembered this time.
Yes.
I really appreciate it for you giving us the presentation, and I'll see you around.
See you around.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.